What if Africa colonized Europe instead? History feels inevitable, until you imagine it running in the opposite direction. We're taught that Europe rose, explored, conquered, and reshaped the world. That Africa was colonized, divided, exploited. But history is not destiny. It's timing. It's geography. It's power. At the right moment. So ask a dangerous question. What if Africa had colonized Europe instead? Not as a fantasy, not as revenge, but as a realistic alternate history. The answer would not just change borders, it would change how the world understands civilization itself. It begins with one difference. Centuries before European expansion, Africa does not fracture under external pressure. Instead, major African civilizations across North, West, East, and Southern Africa remain connected through trade, diplomacy, and shared knowledge. Ironworking advances faster, navigation improves earlier. Ocean-going ships dominate African coasts by the early Middle Ages. While Europe remains divided, feudal, fragmented, constantly at war, Africa becomes the global crossroads of trade between Asia, the Middle East, and the Atlantic. Gold, salt, ivory, textiles, mathematics, medicine flow outward from African ports. And then the ships sail north. At first, it's trade. African merchants establish coastal settlements along the Mediterranean and Atlantic Europe. They bring advanced navigation, written law, centralized administration. European kingdoms, weakened by plagues and internal conflict, welcome the trade. Until trade becomes influence. Influence becomes control. And control becomes colonization. African powers do not arrive calling themselves conquerors. They arrive as administrators. They map Europe. They tax it. They reorganize it. European ports are renamed. African languages become the language of government, trade, and education. Local rulers are allowed to govern, under supervision. This is not portrayed as invasion. It is called stabilization. European lands are described as underdeveloped. Their people portrayed as tribal, superstitious, culturally fragmented. Their religions are studied, categorized, and often dismissed as backward. Sound familiar? European labor is extracted to fuel African empires. Timber, minerals, agriculture, everything flows south. European craftsmen are valued, but never equal. African administrators write reports describing Europeans as naturally suited for labor, resistant to heat, physically strong, but intellectually limited. Pseudoscience follows. Skull measurements, cultural hierarchies, civilizational rankings. European identity is reduced to something primitive, something to be managed. Education is introduced, but selectively. European children are taught African history, African heroes, African philosophy. Their own past is minimized or erased. Speaking indigenous European languages is discouraged in schools. Success means assimilation. Resistance means punishment. Some European elites collaborate, adopting African dress, names, customs. Others rebel, forming underground movements that history later labels as ungrateful or violent. Rebellions are crushed. Not always brutally, often bureaucratically. Borders are redrawn with straight lines that ignore ethnic and cultural realities. Rival groups are forced together. Others are separated deliberately. Division becomes policy. Europe does not industrialize for itself. It industrializes for Africa. Factories are built, but owned elsewhere. Railways exist, but to extract resources. Wealth flows outward, while poverty becomes normalized. European suffering is explained as temporary, necessary, civilizing. Centuries pass. African capitals grow rich, monumental, historic. European cities exist, but as shadows of what they could have been. Museums in Africa display European artifacts, ancient swords, religious symbols, cultural objects taken for preservation. Europeans visiting Africa are told to be grateful their history was saved. Their accents are mocked, their traditions exoticized, their pain minimized. Eventually, the world begins to change. Ideas of independence spread. European intellectuals, educated in African institutions, begin to question the system. They use African philosophical language to argue against African domination. They are told they are not ready for self-rule, that Europe lacks unity, lacks maturity, lacks experience. Sound familiar? Eventually, after long struggle, Europe begins to break free. Borders are unstable, economies are weak, trauma runs deep. Former colonizers write the history books. They frame their rule as benevolent, necessary, progressive. They say Europe would have collapsed without them, and the world accepts it. Now pause and look at this story again, because nothing in it required Africans to be crueler, smarter, or more ruthless than Europeans were in our real history. It only required power at the right time. This is the uncomfortable truth. Colonization was not about race. It was about advantage, technology, timing, organization, narrative control. If Africa had colonized Europe, the world would not be morally inverted. It would be structurally identical. The same justifications, the same violence, the same erasure. Just different names. And today, centuries later, people would ask, why can't Europeans just move on? Why do they always bring up the past? Why do they blame colonization for their problems? They would be told, history is history. Get over it. Be grateful. And most people would never question it, because the most powerful legacy of colonization is not territory. It's perspective. Who gets to be normal? Who gets to be developed? Who gets to be human by default? If Africa had colonized Europe instead, the world would not be fairer. It would simply reveal something deeply uncomfortable. That oppression does not come from who you are, but from who holds the pen when history is written. And the most dangerous lie we ever believed is that it could only have gone one way.